Hi guys, thank you for joining me today. Just give me a second to get set up over here. How's everyone doing today? Oh, let's see. Okay. If you guys are joining me, do leave me a message, leave me a comment so that I know who's watching, because sometimes Facebook doesn't show all of the names of people who've logged on. All right, so we're gonna just wait for a little while for more people to join us before we get started on the talk today. So let me know how everyone's doing. For those of you who are watching, let me know how your week has gone and how you've done in the past week with relations to putting the previous talk on empathy into practice if you've been able to. Some stuff happened this week. We got an update from Bengui about the progress of the Tsem Rinpoche Relic Stupa project. Good morning, Yan Fang. Thank you for joining us this morning. And good morning, Sukfan. Thank you for joining me this morning. Yeah, so we got an update from Bengui about the progress of the Tsem Rinpoche Relic Stupa project. So that was very exciting to see how the stupa is coming along and how the progress of the statues that will be going inside the chapel. And as you guys will probably already know, the Ulam Bana packages were also released. So that's been interesting as well. And we also resumed our blog discussion groups, which Rinpoche had advised us to do on a weekly basis. So that is taking place every Wednesday at 8 p.m. So at the moment, we are covering Gurus for Higher Enlightenment for Sale. So that's been very fun. We only managed to get through like 5 pages last week. So yeah, but it was a very good discussion that we had. So yeah, if you guys are tuning in, do leave me a comment so that I can say hello. Because like I said, Facebook doesn't always show who's tuning in. All right, so wait for a couple more people to join us before we get started on this week's topic. Last week I talked about empathy, and I talked about what empathy is and what happens when you don't have empathy, and what a person who lacks empathy is like, and the kind of consequences of that, and how we can stave off empathy fatigue by turning empathy into a tool, combining empathy together with the cultivation of compassion, so that empathy becomes a tool for us to better understand the people that we're trying to help. Before we get started on this week's topic, as usual, do a short prayer to recall and recount and ascribe the source of the information that I'm going to be sharing today. I go for refuge in my Lama, from whom I have received these teachings. I go for refuge in the lineage Lamas, from whom my Lamas received these teachings. All right, so do I need to introduce myself? Hi, my name is Pastor Jinai, based here in Kechara Forest Retreat in Bentong, Malaysia. And as I mentioned earlier, last week I talked about empathy and the causes of empathy, where empathy arises from, the consequences of not having empathy, and how to stave off empathy fatigue, because there's no such thing as something wrong with my computer. So lucky I've got my phone on with me. But consequences of empathy fatigue, and what happens when we have empathy fatigue and how we can stave it off. Oh, hi Jillian, thank you for joining me this morning. All right, so I'm going to follow this talk on my phone because internet problems on my computer. All right, so this week I'm going to be talking about something that I've seen being mentioned a lot online, and that is anxiety. And whether you suffer from anxiety or you see other people suffering from anxiety. And I know that that's been something that's been brought up quite a lot recently, especially because of the current pandemic. So, especially during this pandemic time, when everyone's been confined in close quarters for extended periods of time, or they have maybe been quarantining with people that they don't necessarily find very easy to deal with, or our way of life has changed so drastically in a very short amount of time, and maybe we haven't been given access to our usual coping mechanisms, or we have more time. Something as simple as having more time to read things, follow the news and so on, which may add to our feelings of anxiety. Or we haven't been given access to our usual methods of, even distracting ourselves from the things that are difficult around us. So some people have obviously dealt with the current situation of the pandemic a lot better than other people, and there are many reasons for that, right? Maybe some people have a lot more practice in dealing with anxiety. Some people have a lot more training in it, for example. But that's what I'm going to be talking about today in greater detail. All right, so I think that the toughest thing about the current situation that is anxiety causing for many of us is that we all live and we all work based on patterns. And that's how our life is it goes on. It's based on patterns. And now that those patterns are broken and we don't have our usual coping mechanisms to deal with that break in our patterns, then how do all of us, or many of us, react? Which is these feelings of anxiety come up. And ordinarily we may cling on to certain things or go towards certain activities that help to distract us from these situations that causes anxiety. But perhaps now in a situation like the pandemic, where many people are in lockdown, we don't have access to those usual coping mechanisms. So it's become tougher for many people to deal with these feelings of anxiety. And excuse me, that's actually how our mind works, which is that our mind works based off of patterns. And there were a lot of very fascinating videos that Rinpoche used to show us online. One was called Magic of the Subconscious Mind, or Magic of the Unconscious Mind. And these videos talked about how our mind works based off of patterns, but from a very scientific point of view. And why does our mind work based off of patterns is because it makes it faster and it makes it more efficient for us to kind of navigate the world around us, and to process information. Because if we were to take in all stimulus individually, it would be a lot for our minds and for our brains to handle. And so in order to help us to cope with that, our mind works off of identifying patterns. But at the same time, because it works off of identifying patterns, it makes us miss out on things, because we are only looking for things that confirm that pattern. So when things don't confirm that pattern, subconsciously we're already discarding the information. And that's how we end up developing a pretty skewed view of reality. And the other problem also with working based off of patterns is that when those patterns are broken, then some of us may have difficulties coping with that. And so that's when feelings like anxiety arise. All right, so I'm talking here obviously about anxiety from a more general point of view. Oh, good morning, Jerry. Thank you for joining us today. And Yong Yu Ming, I'm very sorry if I mispronounced your name or didn't pronounce it correctly. Please feel free to correct me in the comment section, all right? But yeah, I'm talking more about anxiety in general, right? So I'm not referring to people who have genuine anxiety disorders. And in those cases, people will need guidance and they will need assistance from a qualified medical professional. I'm talking about everyday anxieties that everyone experiences and how we can deal with it. All right, so before I continue, I just want to say, leave me a message in the comment section below. When was the last time you experienced something that caused you anxiety, and perhaps you can share with us how you dealt with it. All right. So also before I go on, if you guys have any special requests for particular topics to be covered, or for questions to be answered, also let me know and I will try and cover that in an upcoming video. And before I properly get into things, also I just want to say thank you and express my gratitude for the sponsors of today's talk. The first sponsor being Iman, who made the dedication, may all suffering quickly cease, all joy and happiness be fulfilled, and the holy Dharma flourish forevermore. And also today's sharing has been sponsored by Ong Chin Wei. All right, so thank you guys very much for your continued support of these online programs. If you would like to sponsor a talk, there is a link in the description section of this video. So do click on it, because your support does help us to continue to make these online programs available. All right, so thank you guys very much. So, anxiety. What is anxiety? Oh, the anxiety-causing computer not working. Now works. All right, so what is anxiety? Anxiety is our body's natural response to stress. It's this feeling of fear and of apprehension or nervousness about what's to come. And that's something that is key, which is what's to come, which means that it hasn't actually happened yet. So more often than not, anxiety is a reaction to something that is a potential scenario. Right, so it's a projection and it's something that hasn't happened yet. So the feeling that you're experiencing is a reaction to something that technically, practically speaking, it doesn't exist yet. So it's illusory. And it's a reaction, it's a feeling that we have, it's an emotion that we have that's based on a fear of the unknown or a fear of uncertainty. So I listed down a few scenarios, a few situations which could be anxiety causing. So I apologize if any of this is triggering, but perhaps you may be able to identify with some of these, or perhaps you may recognize some of these situations which are anxiety causing. So for example, feeling like you don't measure up to other people in your cohort, so feeling like perhaps you're left behind, or you are not meeting markers of or measures of success for your age, for your social economic background, and so on. That might be anxiety causing to some people when they think about it more and more and more. It may also be anxiety causing for people when they're asked to do something that they're not familiar with, or maybe anxiety causing because we don't want people to figure out or to find out that we don't know how to do it. So instead of admitting that we're not familiar with something, we kind of downplay it in front of them, but in the background we're panicking and thinking, oh my god, what if they find out that I am not as skilled as I proclaim myself to be, or as I portray myself to be. So for some people that could be anxiety causing. For other people, it might also be anxiety causing when they need to go to a new place that they're not familiar with, so that makes them very nervous and fearful. And for other people, perhaps it's going to a job interview or even starting a new job, because there are a lot of unknowns, whether or not you might get the job, whether or not you speak the wrong thing, or you offend the interviewer, or you fail to impress them, or if you're starting a new job, maybe you have a fear of not getting along with your co-workers, or perhaps not being qualified for the job that you interviewed for. So some people might find that anxiety causing. Some people might find it anxiety causing because they are looking into opening an investment account, and they don't find that they're very well versed in financial lingo, financial terms, so they're very nervous about putting in all of their life savings into something that has a great degree of uncertainty and risk. So that might be anxiety causing to some people. But on the other hand, as you can perfectly imagine, that might be not anxiety causing to some people who are very confident in their financial abilities, right? For people who are younger, they may find it anxiety causing when they have to start a new school. So young children, when they're starting their first day of school, kindergarten and so on, there might be feelings of anxiety coming up. And for adults, we find it easier to verbalize and to express our feelings of anxiety, but for young children, they may not have the linguistic ability to do so. So it may manifest as crying or reluctance to go to school, tantrums and so on. For other people, I know for me, it may be anxiety causing when you are asked to give a speech, right? So that's a very common one. People feeling a sense of trepidation or apprehension about having to give a speech or to engage in public talking. So I'm sure you guys are very familiar. What is one coping mechanism that we are all taught about how to deal with anxiety when it comes to giving speeches, imagine your audience in their underwear, right? Or don't make eye contact with them, but look just above them and look at the top of their head. So it looks like you're making eye contact, but you're not. So, like I said, there are all these situations and all of these events in our daily life which may be anxiety causing to some of us. All right, so one thing that all of these things have in common is that all of these scenarios paint an outcome where, or paint a situation whereby the outcome is not guaranteed or the outcome is not assured. But the thing is, how is it that some people are better at dealing with anxiety-causing situations than other people? How is it that some people seem better at coping with anxiety than other people? And that's what I'm going to be talking about today, and hopefully share or impart, share with you guys some of the situations in which I have found myself dealing with feelings of anxiety and how I dealt with it based on advice and based on teachings that Rinpoche has previously given. All right, so first thing I'm going to talk about is how anxiety is not exactly the most constructive emotion to have, and not the most result-oriented or result-driven reaction. So how can anxiety be paralyzing? So anxiety can be all-consuming. Why? Because there is a tendency for us to focus on the feeling of anxiety when it comes up, as opposed to addressing the cause of it. So, for example, I'm not a fan of giving public talks. I'm not a fan of, my reaction to dealing with public quite often is quite anxiety driven, to be completely honest. How do I deal with it? I laugh a lot, perhaps talk a lot faster, which you guys have probably noticed. When I get excited or I get nervous, I tend to talk faster, or throw jokes, or listen to music. So that's something that was shared with me recently, was before you deal with members of the public, or before you start to interact with the public, in the half an hour before that, don't focus on the talk. Do everything you can to do something else, do something that relaxes you. So for me, it's listening to music. So I listen to music in the half an hour before I'm supposed to interact with the public, and that calms me down. All right, so why do I talk about anxiety being paralyzing? And because it can be all-consuming, because if I don't have something to direct my mind towards something else, then all I can focus on is how anxious I am, and all the what ifs, right? So that's the thing about anxiety, is it's full of what ifs. Anxiety is a reaction to a scenario when all you're thinking is, what if it's like this? What if it's like that? What if it's like this? What if this happens? What if that happens? What if these things go wrong, right? So anxiety causes us to stop before we even start something, because we end up becoming so focused on our reaction that all of these potentialities arise in our mind, where we project an outcome or result that is not assured or guaranteed, may not necessarily exist, and our mind tends to gravitate towards conjuring up the worst of something that could happen, right? So anxiety can cause us to stop something before we start. And so when the anxiety takes over and we can't deal with it, and it overwhelms us, there can be a situation where we find we start avoiding or we start rejecting new experiences, because before they even begin, because we don't know what the outcome may be, and so we prefer not to find ourselves in that situation because we cannot assure ourselves of a particular result. So we start to avoid, and we start to fall into this habit or pattern of avoiding. So just as how our mind finds patterns to help us to navigate the world more easily, our mind also creates patterns. And so when we fall into this pattern of avoiding situations, it will happen again and again, right? So at best, when we fall into a pattern of avoiding new experiences, at best what happens is we don't get to enjoy new experiences. So for example, if every time we are met with a roller coaster, for example, and we know that it's going to cause us anxiety, the roller coaster could be perfectly safe, but our mind starts to play up. And our mind starts to think, what if the roller coaster crashes? What if somebody didn't do their job and, they didn't do the maintenance properly? Or for example, people getting on a flight. What if, one of many mechanical failures occur? What if the pilot didn't have a good night's rest, and so on and so on? And so what happens then is, at best, we start avoiding new experiences. So for a person who has never flown before, they may find that they never fly. For a person who is anxious at the sight of roller coasters, they may find that they don't get to enjoy the thrill of being on a roller coaster. These are very prosaic, very basic examples, all right? But I think you guys get the idea. So, good morning to Stephen. And good morning, Waiting. Thank you for joining us today. All right. Oh, good morning, Rina. Rina, I heard that you came and visited Kechara Forest Retreat with your parents last week. So I hope that you had a very enjoyable visit. All right. Thank you for coming to see us after the MCO was lifted. We moved into the RMCO. So as I was talking about, anxiety can cause us to stop before we even start. And at best, we miss out on new experiences. And at worst, we don't improve because we don't try. So why? Why do we not improve? Because how do you learn? You learn by engaging in new experiences. You learn by putting yourself in situations that you've never been in before, and then making mistakes, failing, and then picking up lessons from it. So at worst, anxiety causes us to not improve because we never end up in situations where we are pushed to try something new and therefore pushed to learn. All right. But the thing about avoidance and the thing about rejecting new experiences is that it reinforces our anxiety. Why? Because once we don't try something new or we don't undergo a new experience, we relax. So anxiety is our blood pressure going up. Anxiety is our breathing becoming more shallow. But when that happens when we're faced with a new situation. And so when we avoid that situation, our body calms down. Our breathing deepens again and we relax. And then our mind is trained that fear and nervousness is bad, and that sense of relaxation is good. And so we start to look for things, and we start to look for situations that cause us to relax. And because then we start to avoid negative or difficult situations, negative situations, and we start to gravitate towards situations that cause us to relax, then that reinforces our anxiety, because always don't go for this thing, always go for this situation, always go for the situation that causes you to relax. And so then that reinforces our comfort zone, because after a while, it gets harder and harder and harder for us to jump into new situations. It gets harder for us because we train ourselves into thinking that any state that pushes our comfort zone is bad. If this situation is new, if I'm unfamiliar with the situation, if the outcome is uncertain, if the outcome is not assured, if the outcome is not guaranteed, and it causes me these feelings of nervousness and fear, I should avoid it. I should never go towards it. And therefore, what invariably ends up happening is we don't put ourselves in situations that push our comfort zone. We don't put ourselves in situations that are unfamiliar to us, and therefore compels us to be more creative, compels us to think in different ways and to think and approach that situation with a different attitude or a different perspective. And so we end up falling into our comfort zones of thinking that where I am now is fine, and I don't need to be any different, and I don't need to be in a situation that pushes me to be different or to think differently. All right, so as you can imagine, when that happens over and over again, over a period of time, what happens is we have a tendency not to move past the anxiety, and we have a tendency not to move past our comfort zone. All right, so that's something that Rinpoche always talks about, is comfort zones. Comfort zones in our spiritual and in our secular success. So if you are perfectly content with not taking risk, for example, in your business, and not striking out, for example, into new markets, then the state or the status that we have at the moment is all the status we're ever going to have if all the karmic conditions for that state remain the same and they never change, which, as we all know, because Buddhism's tenet is impermanence, we all know that karmic conditions for something will never remain the same. All right, so it's not possible for us to always remain in the same state, but that's what some of us like to believe. All right, so that's something that Rinpoche always talks about. Pushing our comfort zones secularly and spiritually. Spiritually, how? Because when we are with a teacher, and we're with a teacher who cares about us, our teacher can see if we are falling into a pattern of complacency and of habit. For example, laziness, for example, mental distraction, for example, coming up with excuses not to attend Dharma talks or not to drive out to Bentong to volunteer because it's too far and so on, right? So our teacher can see all of these patterns developing in us, and our teacher will, the benefit of being near a teacher is that our teacher will identify these patterns and then train us to push past it. And that's something that Buddhism trains us to do, which is to observe, to recognize, to acknowledge a situation that is causing us anxiety, causing us nervousness, or causing us fear, and then to move past it, to look past it, to look beyond it. All right, so how can we deal with our anxiety? All right, and so let's talk first about dealing with feelings of anxiety in ourselves. And why do I do that? Because when we can learn to recognize anxiety in us and we learn how to handle it, then we also know how to recognize anxiety in other people and how to handle anxious people. All right, so as I mentioned, as I asked earlier, how come some people are better at handling anxiety than others? How come we see some people constantly putting themselves into or constantly dealing very successfully with anxiety? How come we see some people in situations that we know will conjure up feelings of anxiety with us, but they don't seem to have any reaction at all? Why? 3 main approaches. The first one being training. So they see the anxiety and they get over the anxiety, and they do this over and over again. So, for example, if we are, okay, let me use a very personal example. Anxiety, we're dealing with members of the public, right? So how do I get over the anxiety? By training. So doing it over and over again, so that finally, eventually, I retrain or rehabilitate my mind into realizing that it's not as fearful or as scary an interaction as I would conjure it up to be in my head. So training is number 1. Number 2 is practice. So doing something over and over again until you get good at it. So for example, babies. If babies were to be anxious when they are learning to walk, they're not going to learn how to walk. They're going to be stuck on crawling forever. So what do? We train our children how to walk. We get them to practice over and over again. And then when they fall, we comfort them. When they stumble, we comfort them. When they are successful, we cheer them on. So practicing over and over again, learning how to walk until you can finally walk. And then learning from, if you want to go down that route, learning how to walk and then moving on to learning how to run. All right, so training and then practice. And then finally, learning how to approach anxiety differently. So some people are very good at taking on anxiety because instead of identifying the feeling of fear as something bad, they approach it differently. So they take it on as an adrenaline rush instead. So why is it that some people are very risk-driven? Like they will do base jumping, they'll go hang gliding, they'll go skydiving and so on. And other people are petrified of heights. So some people view that fear and view that physiological reaction as an adrenaline rush, and then other people view that fear and that physiological reaction as something to be scared of. And so approaching anxiety differently also helps us to become better at handling it. Good morning, Sharon. Thank you for joining us today. All right, so how do we deal with anxiety? How can we successfully deal with anxiety? First thing is acknowledging the fact that you are anxious. So a lot of the problems that we have, and one of the biggest things that creates suffering for us, is that we fight. We fight against things that are happening and we refuse to accept them. So I'm not talking about, injustices, all right? I'm not talking about major things like that. I'm talking about things that go wrong in our lives and our refusal to accept our responsibility and our involvement in it when they happen. So I'm talking about when things go wrong in our life and these things causing feelings of anxiety because we refuse to accept that they have happened, and we fight against them. So for example, when our car breaks down before we go to work, or when we open our fridge at the end of a long day and there's no food inside, or when we go to a job interview and we're not prepared. Okay, so things like this, and we fight against them. Some people just look at these so-called problems as events, and they accept the problem as it is. It's just an event, and then they buckle down and they think and they apply a solution. Other people look at these problems as something that has double or triple the meaning, and then when we have these meanings in our mind, it spins out of control. All right, so we read more into it, and then by reading more into it and not just being solution oriented, the event spins out of control in our mind, and hence our reaction spins out of control in our mind. All right, so what can we do to stop that? What can we do to stop us from falling into that pattern of things spinning out of control in our minds, and then we ourselves amplifying our own feelings of anxiety? What we can do is we can break down the situation that is in front of us. So, is there something about the situation in front of me, for example, is there something about the situation in front of me that I can do something about? All right. For example, cycling on the road is a very recent example of something that's anxiety causing for me. So when I am about to cycle on the road, I start to get very nervous. I start to get very fearful. My mind thinks, oh, what happens if there are big trucks on the road? What happens if there's a tire puncture? What happens if I fail to shift gear, and so on? And I fall off my bike, which I did 2 days ago. I fell off. I crashed into wet sand. But anyway, so now you guys can think, right? Take a moment to think of something that's anxiety causing for you, and how you can possibly break down that situation, and then by breaking down the situation, be able to deal with it or approach it more practically. So to share with you guys, a personal example is for me, cycling on the road. So I'm anxious about going on the road. So is there something that I can do about it? For example, if my personal physical safety is something that causes me anxiety, is there something I can do about that? For example, can I wear brighter clothing? Can I practice more in a safer environment so that I'm more confident on the bike? And when I'm more confident, then I'm less nervous on the road, and I'm less defensive on the road. Can I ride with people who are more experienced than me? So looking at a situation and then breaking down the elements of it, that's the word I was looking for, the elements of it that are anxiety causing, will help us to approach it in a more practical, with a more practical attitude of dealing with it. All right. So when you break down the situation that's in front of you, then the next question we should ask is, can I control the situation that's in front of me? Can I control the event that's taking place in front of me? So for example, I need to give a speech. I don't feel great about my chances of doing so well, or the speech being so well received. So is there something that I can do to manage the outcome? So is there something I can do to manage my nervousness about cycling? Is there something I can do to manage my anxiety about starting a new job? Is there something I can do about my anxiety about being given a project that I'm not familiar with? Is there something I can do about my anxiety about meeting or going into a meeting with people whom I know are going to be very difficult? For example, a client who's very difficult. Is there something I can do? So breaking down the situation and then thinking, what can I do to manage the situation in front of me? If I'm sitting in traffic and I'm late for an appointment, is there something I can do to control that? Is it better for me to sit in the car and start to feel all anxious about missing the appointment, and then consider, or maybe I should, is it worth it for me to break the speed limit so that I can make it there on time? Or is the person that I'm about to meet going to become very upset with me? Instead of thinking about all those things and letting your mind spin off into those scenarios, which are not guaranteed outcomes, right? It's not guaranteed that if you break the speed limit, you'll get there on time. It's not guaranteed that the person you're going to meet will be upset with you for being late. So instead of letting our mind spin off into these non-guaranteed outcomes, non-assured outcomes, is there something that we can do that's productive? For example, calling ahead and apologizing sincerely to the person and warning them ahead of time that we're going to be late so that they can prepare, or so that they can, be ready to wait for us. All right, so okay, Sharon, I see your question. How can we help our friend or loved one cope and overcome with anxiety? So I'm going to cover that at the end. Do we have trauma from a previous experience, and maybe the current experience in front of us has the same hallmarks of that previous trauma causing experience, and so our anxiety is arising from our doubt in our ability to handle the situation. So when we break down a situation like that, what we're doing is we're giving ourselves a moment to review an event in front of us and address it for what it is, instead of addressing it for what we have made it out to be. All right, so as you can kind of tell, anxiety is sort of like a runaway train. Because once you get into this pattern of feeling anxious and this pattern of apprehension and fear and nervousness, our mind is very, very effective, at conjuring up all sorts of events and all sorts of possible results and outcomes and what ifs that reinforce this feeling of anxiety. So when we stop and we take a moment to break it down, what we're doing is we are giving ourselves a break from that runaway train and allowing ourselves to review a situation for what it really is, and therefore what we can really do to manage it, as opposed to not what we've made it out to be. All right, and that is why meditation is very, very important, because meditation teaches us to be aware. First thing is, it teaches us to become aware of our body. And that is something that's very important, and that's something that is recommended for people who experience a lot of anxiety. So become aware of our body, become aware of our physical reactions. Are our palms sweating? Is our breathing getting shallower and becoming more ragged? Is there a tightness in our chest? And is all our anxiety focused in our chest? Are our shoulders becoming more tense? Are our stomach muscles becoming more tense and bunched up? So, like I mentioned, when we're anxious. Good morning, Joseph. Thank you for joining me today. All right, so become aware of our body, become aware of our physical reactions when we start to be anxious over a situation. And when we're anxious, as I mentioned, our thoughts are like a runaway train, which is going at 100 miles an hour. Without realizing, we start spinning and we start thinking about all of the what ifs, what if this, what if that, what if this, and so on. And when we meditate, for example, when we do JP's mindful morning meditation on Saturdays and Sunday mornings, what is it that JP always talks about? What is it that JP always coaches us to do? When you see your thoughts wandering, bring it back. When you see your thoughts wandering towards something else, bring it back to the breath. When you start thinking about how your backside is uncomfortable, how you are hungry, how your back hurts, see your thought, observe it, and then bring it back, catch it, bring it back to the breath. So he talks about that over and over again, every single week. All right, if you guys are familiar with it. Oh, tashi dile genla, genla devo imbe. All right, so meditation in this case is very, very important for us to learn how to deal with anxiety, because meditation and learning to bring our attention back to the present teaches us to interrupt the pattern of projecting fearful thoughts into an unknown future. So this practice of catching our mind and then bringing it back to our breath, we can then extrapolate to other areas of our life. So for example, when our thoughts run away with us, when our mind runs away with thoughts and feelings of anxiety, we practice in recognizing it, catching it, and then bringing it back to the present. So meditation helps us to tame our minds. For lack of a non-cliche term, meditation helps us to tame our minds by recognizing, by being fully aware and fully focused on the present, and recognizing when our minds are starting to run away, recognizing when we are starting to have a physical reaction to something, and then catching ourselves, interrupting that pattern of fearful thinking and projecting it into an unknown future, catching it and then bringing it back to the present, all right? And so as we meditate more and more and more, what we find is that our minds calm down more and then we become more in control of it. So we are able to catch it even before the anxiety arises. And that's how you can see old monks, they're never anxious. And old monks always make you feel like, I'm talking about old practice monks, all right? Monks who actually practice and engage in their meditations, not monks who, with respect, wear robes only, all right? So monks who actually practice. We never see old monks suffering from anxiety or suffering from feelings of fear or feelings of apprehension. We always see old monks who are practiced being very fully aware and being fully in the now, in the present, right? And whenever you're with them, you always feel like you are the most important person in front. The person who's in front of them at that moment is always the most important person in the world. All right, so you never see an anxious old monk. Why? Because they've been meditating for many, 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 many years. It's us who are not as practiced as these old monks who, suffer from anxiety. But if you put an old monk and you tell him, go to Australia and give a teaching, yeah, for a split second, maybe he'd be like, well, okay, I don't know Australia. I'm not very familiar with Australia, but it's not anxiety. It's a thinking in practicality. Who do I connect with? How do I teach? How do I connect with the people? And so on and so on. So it's more an approach of practicality as opposed to approach of anxiety. All right, so meditation is very important. And if we do our meditations correctly, meditation is very, very good in helping us to deal with anxiety, as well as it provides us with a tool and an ability to stop and interrupt that pattern of thought so that we can actually break down the situation in front of us, acknowledge the fact that we're feeling anxious, and then deal with it in a practical manner. All right. Now, how else can we deal with anxiety? And this will also help to answer Sharon's question on how we can help our friend or loved one cope with or overcome anxiety. And that is to cultivate compassion. So I do realize that I bring this up almost every week, but it's Buddhism teaches us to meditate on the four immeasurables. So loving kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity. So every day when we do our sadhana and when we recite the four immeasurables, cultivating the four immeasurables, all right? And by cultivating the four immeasurables, what Rinpoche has taught us is that cultivating the four immeasurables can help us to replace states of mind that cause suffering to us and cause suffering to people around us. So for example, anxiety and fearful states of mind, they cause suffering to us. Why? Because we are suffering, thinking, oh my God, what if I do this and it comes out wrong? How am I going to deal with it? That feeling of anxiety, that state of mind is suffering for us. And so when other people interact with us and they're constantly interacting with somebody who's always anxious, it leads to worry in their mind, it leads to concern in their mind, and therefore that is suffering for them as well. So by cultivating the four immeasurables, it can help us to replace these states of mind that cause suffering to ourselves and to others with states of mind that create benefit for other people. All right, so when our fear and our anxiety is increasing, we should meditate on the four immeasurables. Why? Because by meditating on the four immeasurables, oh gosh, Tashi Delit Chering Peldinla and Tashi Delit Choda. How is Nepal? Namaste. Nice to see you here this morning. I hope the situation in Nepal is getting better because I read about some protests that you guys had. So yeah, I hope everything is kind of calming down now. Why should we meditate on the four immeasurables when we are feeling anxious? Because it disrupts the pattern of thinking about how I will be harmed and how I will not benefit, and how it's no use for me to try because I won't be successful and so on. And it replaces this thought, this pattern of thinking about how I won't benefit and how I might be harmed and so on. It replaces it with thinking or with a feeling of caring for others. All right, so remember what I said a few weeks ago about how when we are selfish, but we try to redirect our selfish energy and try to practice focusing out. And by practicing focusing out and cultivating that feeling and that habit of focusing out, eventually it stops feeding energy into our selfishness, and it takes away energy from our selfishness, and over time it reduces it. So it's the same thing. When we stop paying attention to our anxiety, we stop feeding our energy of anxiety, over time that anxiety naturally reduces. How can we do that? By focusing on other people and focusing on cultivating loving kindness, on focusing on cultivating joy and equanimity and on compassion. All right, so how can you do that? What is one practice for doing that? We can also try practicing Tonglen. So, for example, when you breathe in, and as you're breathing in, acknowledge the suffering and the anxiety that everybody feels. And then while you're breathing out, wishing everybody happiness and well-being and peace. All right, so that is why Rinpoche taught us that, for example, the Lama Chopa Tsok, Lama Chopa offering is a very, very powerful practice. Why? Because in Lama Chopa, what we are doing as part of the practice is that we are praying to accomplish the yoga of exchange of self for others. And we're encouraged to meditate on this, and we're encouraged to pray for this. And we're encouraged to pray that even if I must remain in the fiery house of Avicii for the sake of 1 century being alone, may I do so happily. Right? So if you guys are familiar with the Lama Chopa Tsok, that's one of the verses. Even if I must remain in the fiery house of Avicii for the sake of 1 century being alone. Now, what does it mean to pray for that? All right, what's the benefit of praying for something like that? And I know that when I say that, some of you might be thinking, oh my God, if I pray for it, will it happen? Will I take rebirth in Avicii? Okay, first of all, yes, there is a likelihood that any of us can take rebirth there because of many countless previous lives of karma. Excuse me. So, more importantly, if we genuinely believe that it's possible for us to take rebirth in Avicii for the sake of 1 century being alone, then it opens up our minds to the possibility that we are able to handle much more, especially in this life. All right, think about it. If every single day you sit there and you pray, may I remain in the fiery house of Avicii for the sake of 1 century being alone, or until samsara is emptied, may I take rebirth over and over again in order to benefit them. If every single day you're sitting there and meditating and praying for and generating this genuine feeling that may this be possible, may I be able to do this. If you're able to pray and if you're able to not feel anxious about taking rebirth in Avicii for another century being, doesn't everything else in your life, when you open your eyes and you know your prayers are over, doesn't everything in your life become so much more manageable? What could be worse than taking rebirth in Avicii? What could be worse in your life that's happening around you that could be worse than taking rebirth in Avicii? And so when you pray and you meditate every single day on something as powerful as that, for the sake of all sentient beings, or for as long as sentient beings remain in samsara, may I take rebirth over and over again. If you're able to do that, and if you're able to handle that, everything in your life becomes so much more manageable. All right? Instantly, everything that we complain about, instantly everything that we find anxious in our life no longer causes us anxiety, because suddenly it becomes possible for me to generate this feeling of compassion towards somebody else, cultivate this compassion towards somebody else, that I can take rebirth in the deepest, most fiery of hells for them. All right? So how can anxiety exist in the same mind space as somebody else who finds it possible to suffer in Avicii for the sake of other people? Anxiety can't exist in the same mind space as somebody like that. All right, so if day after day you pray to be able to take on the suffering of sentient beings, it sets our mind that challenges are okay, that difficult things are okay, that difficult situations are okay. And then if we get suffering in this life, how can we complain? And how can we be upset? We pray for it. We prayed for the possibility of getting on suffering. We prayed for the possibility of taking on other people's suffering, taking on other people's burden. So instead of praying for a lighter load, right? This is something that Rinpoche is very fond of saying. Instead of praying not to experience suffering, instead of praying not to be challenged, instead of praying not to experience difficulties, we should actually pray. A bodhisattva always prays to be born in the most difficult, darkest places. Pray for that, but pray for the ability to be able to take on more. Pray for broader shoulders to be able to take on other people's burden, instead of praying for less difficulties for ourselves, which it's not a bad thing. It doesn't make you a bad person. Everybody prays not to have suffering. Everybody prays not to have that. But recognize that suffering is going to happen. Recognize that, we have the karma to suffer. And so instead of praying not to suffer in this life and praying not to suffer in every single life, pray that actually suffering does manifest. Pray that we actually do experience the results of our karma, but we are in a place and in a position that we are able to deal with it more effectively. All right, so that is why Rinpoche encouraged us to do our sadhanas every single day. Because if we do our sadhanas every single day we will be habituated into meditating on the four immeasurables. We will be habituated into meditating and generating loving kindness, into generating compassion and joy and equanimity. All right, and excuse me. Oh gosh. All right, so Sharon, I'm almost at the part where I answer your question. But if we just follow Rinpoche's instructions on this, on doing our sadhanas every single day, there are so many more benefits that we have never thought of. We just think that, doing our sadhanas to every single day is to connect with the three jewels, is to create a connection with Tushita, to take rebirth in Tushita after we pass away and so on. Yes, all of that is, excuse me, absolutely true. But there are also so many more benefits to doing our sadhanas every single day that we might not necessarily be aware of, that may not have been explained to us. So, our sadhana isn't just a time for us to pray to our yidam, or pray to Dojo Shukden and ask him for favors, or ask for money, or ask for our businesses to go well, or ask for obstacles to be cleared, and so on. Our sadhanas also are a time for us to sit down and to habituate ourselves into generating different feelings like compassion, feelings like bodhicitta, which can replace in our mind space states of mind that have been causing us suffering. So there is a rhyme and a reason and a basis behind the prayers and the sequence of the prayers that we do, and on the meditations, which we may not necessarily be aware of. But if we just follow our Lama's instructions, and we just follow our Lama's suggestions and personal advice to us, and we engage in them, we will automatically experience so many more benefits that we may not necessarily be aware of, because perhaps there wasn't time enough to explain to us, or we did not have the merits to receive the explanation at the time. So I just wanted to emphasize at this point how very, very important it is for us to follow our Lama's instructions. For example, to do our sadhanas every single day, because there are so many benefits, spiritually speaking, prosaically speaking, whatever, that we may not necessarily be aware of, that we will experience anyway, as a matter of course, by doing our sadhanas every single day. All right. So how do you handle an anxious person? All right. So if you're supposed to cultivate compassion, in order to replace anxiety within ourselves, we should therefore also handle an anxious person, or handle, what was the wording that Sharon used? Let's see. How do we help our friend or loved one cope or overcome with anxiety? How do we handle an anxious person? With compassion and with gentleness and without judgment. So I was actually proofreading something the other day, and it was something that Rinpoche had written. And in this piece that Rinpoche had written, Rinpoche had mentioned something that his guru in Los Angeles, Geshe Suchun Gyaltsen, had mentioned, which is when people are in pain, don't give them more pain. When people are hurting, don't hurt them more. So when you see a loved one experiencing anxiety, how do you help them cope? With compassion, with gentleness, and without judgment. So remember, first thing to do is remember that there are things that cause you anxiety. And so you are no different to someone else. So be understanding of that. So when you see somebody else experiencing anxiety, remember that their feelings of anxiety are very, very valid to them. And so recognize that and don't judge them for it. And remember that judgment isn't constructive. and it doesn't help them to address the cause of their anxiety. So don't laugh at them, don't make fun of them, don't invalidate their feelings of anxiety, don't use language that reduces what it is that they're feeling. All right. So remember that there are things that cause you anxiety, and then remember that not to apply judgment to them. And remember that the things that used to cause you anxiety perhaps no longer cause you anxiety, and therefore it takes time for people to get over things that cause them anxiety. So be patient with people, all right, who are anxious. And remember, very, very important thing is, remember, don't react to the anxiety. Why? Because the anxiety is already a reaction to something else. All right. So if you react to the anxiety, remember that number one, the anxiety is a reaction to something else. And number two, the anxiety is not who they are. The anxiety is something that, it's a reaction. It's not a permanent part of who they are. It will come and it will go just as much as your anxiety comes and goes as well. All right. So don't react to the anxiety and then create something else out of it, and put yourself in their shoes. So what would help you to get over your anxiety? Sometimes instructing a person through a solution or towards a solution doesn't help, but guiding them towards it does. All right. So first thing is, remember that you have experiences or feelings of anxiety as well. Remember not to apply judgment to them. Remember that things that used to cause you anxiety no longer cause you anxiety, and so it took you time to get over it, and so it will take somebody else time to get over it, and therefore please be patient. All right. And remember that their anxiety is already a reaction to something else, so don't react to the anxiety, and put yourself in their shoes. What would help you? What are things that you do to help you to get over anxiety? And remember that telling them to do it may not necessarily always be the most helpful approach, but guiding them towards it may. So being there for them. Let them know that if they fail, or if things don't go as well as they planned, that you will be there for them with patience, and that you'll be there for them without judgment. All right. Finally, most important thing is, try not to use dismissive language. So it's all in your head. It's not such a big deal. It's all in your imagination. Try not to think so much about it. Things like that. All right. Why? Because for them, the feeling of anxiety, experience of anxiety is very, very real. Is anxiety caused by ego? Yes, it is. Is anxiety caused by us trying to protect a false sense of the I and feeling this need to protect it? Yes, it is. All right. All of that may be true, but at a time when somebody is feeling anxious, giving them a Dharma talk is not going to be very helpful at all. So imagine you're feeling anxious because you've got a job interview coming up, or you're feeling anxious because you have a very difficult meeting ahead. Is it going to be very helpful for you when somebody comes and tells you, hey, actually, you don't really exist. There is no inherent I. The ultimate reality is emptiness. There is no inherent I, and therefore there is no I to experience anxiety, and therefore don't be anxious because there is no I. It's all you trying to protect the ego. Is that going to be helpful to your anxiety, to you coping with your anxiety when you are feeling anxious? If somebody else comes out and tells you all of that, it's not going to be, right? At best, it provides you with a momentary distraction. At worst, it provides you with a reason to want to punch the other person in the face, right? So, oh, hi David. Hi Kamala. David, it was nice to meet you the other day. So try not to use dismissive language when someone's feeling anxious. Don't tell them it's all in your head, it's not a big deal, it's all in your imagination, and don't give them a Dharma talk at that time because it's not helpful. All of it may be true, but it's not beneficial. So think, is your speech beneficial? Is your suggestion beneficial? An anxious person may already feel at that time that by bringing the anxiety to you, they're already making an imposition on your time, all right, or making an imposition on your attention and so on. So if they actually have the opportunity or even the courage to verbalize their concerns, minimizing it by using dismissive language will already add to the mix of emotions that they're already feeling, all right, and mix of emotions that they're already struggling to deal with. So how do you help somebody deal or cope with anxiety? Be there for them. without judgment, be there for them with patience, and be there for them with compassion. And if you have the opportunity to do so skillfully, help them to break down the situation in front of them. Guide them towards solutions that address the root cause of what is causing them anxiety. And that was something that Rinpoche was very, very good at, right? So when people were feeling anxious, Rinpoche never, well, in most cases, depending on the person, Rinpoche would generally not tell the person, oh, you should do that, and deal with the anxiety that way. That wasn't Rinpoche's way. Rinpoche would be there with the person, take care of them, make sure that everything else in their life is steady and okay, and then Rinpoche will work through them very slowly, very gently, and very patiently to address the things that are causing them anxiety. And that's exactly the same approach that Rinpoche applied with Kechara Soup Kitchen. So, for example, when people are homeless, they do experience feelings of anxiety and feelings of fear when they're dealing with somebody who comes to claim to want to help them. So, instead of jumping the gun and going straight to, oh, you should get a job and apply for jobs so that you can get a house, in a situation where somebody is homeless, obviously you telling them, stating the obvious, award for being Mr. Obvious, it's not going to be very helpful to them. So what was Rinpoche's advice? Give them food. Build trust. Be patient. Take your time with them so that when they are ready, then gently guide them towards the things that will address the root cause of the situation that they're in. So instead of jumping the gun right at the very beginning and telling them, go and apply for a job. Why are you homeless if you're not applying for a job? Go and get a house, get a loan, and so on. What Rinpoche suggested, what Rinpoche advised was build trust, build a relationship with somebody, and be patient with them. Give them, and do that through food. Do that through distributing food. And so that over time, when you have that trust and they recognize that no matter what they do, if they fail, you're still going to be there for them, then they will feel brave enough and they will feel that sense of courage in order to actually address the root cause of the problem. All right. So when I talk about cultivating compassion to deal with feelings of anxiety for ourselves, it's also cultivating compassion so that we can help other people to address the anxiety. It's compassionate to be patient. It's compassionate to be non-judgmental. It's compassionate to remember that there is no separation between ourselves and others, that just as much as I don't want suffering, another person does not want suffering either. It's compassionate to remember that everyone is at a different stage of their spiritual progress. Everyone is at a different stage of their ability to deal with anxiety, and therefore we must approach each individual according to their propensity, according to their tendencies, and according to their level of readiness. Right? And that was something that Rinpoche always advised. And yes, Sharon, your suggestion that to remind someone with anxiety to take deep breaths. Exactly. So, as what I mentioned earlier about becoming aware of our physical reactions. Is our breathing becoming more shallow? Are our palms sweating? All right. So, why do we tell people to take deep breaths? Why do we train ourselves to become more aware of our physical reaction? Because it helps to break that pattern of projecting harmful thoughts into an uncertain future. All right, so taking deep breaths gives us a second to focus on something else instead of the situation that's causing us anxiety. And that's why meditation is so important. As I mentioned earlier, as JP has mentioned, as Rinpoche has mentioned, and so on. All right, so remember, guys, yes, I made it just to 1 hour this week. Not 1 hour, 10 minutes or 1 hour, 30 minutes. But remember, guys, cultivate compassion. Do your sadhanas every single day because it does have an indirect impact on the negative states of mind that we find ourselves operating in or navigating with in our lives. All right. Meditation being very, very important to help to train us to break this pattern of projecting harmful thoughts and acknowledging the fact that we are anxious and not fighting it, and breaking down the situation and dealing with that situation as it is and not what we have made it out to be. All right. So if you guys have any questions, please feel free to ask them. Kind of run over this week, in spite of my best intent to keep it down to 1 hour. But If you guys have any questions, please feel free to leave them as a comment in the thread below this live stream, and I will answer them as soon as this video is over. Take a moment after this video is over to reflect on the past week. Have you been in a situation that's caused you anxiety? And what was your immediate reaction? How did you feel? If you can't remember it, how did you feel physically? Some of us, feel like a sickening feeling or like we feel like the pit of our stomach and so on, and we feel nauseated and so on. Some of us get very sweaty. Some of us get dry throat. That's why I'm drinking water. Some of us, our breathing gets shallow and so on. All right, so take a moment to reflect on the past week. Were you in a situation that caused you anxiety, and how did you deal with it? How did you react to it? And what was your physical reaction to it? And then as we move into the new week, when you come across a situation that causes you anxiety, learn to recognize that feeling, learn to recognize your reaction, learn to recognize the things that trigger that sense of anxiety, and then stop and take a minute to stop. Take a second to stop and think, is my reaction to this helpful? Is my reaction to this constructive? Can I do something to manage the outcome? If I cannot do something to manage the outcome, is me feeling anxious going to be helpful towards a successful resolution? And if I can manage the outcome, what can I do and what can I apply immediately in order to manage this outcome? So that I have as close to a successful resolution as possible. It may not be the one that is ideal, but maybe it's not the one that's the worst. All right? So think about it that way. Kyung Young, keep chanting. Yeah, keep chanting. That's a good suggestion. All right. So so think about it that way as you move into the new week. All right. So before I go, just a few short reminders. Number one, Doji Shukden Sadhana at 2 p.m. this afternoon on the Chinese Kechara Facebook fan page, as well as the live chat by Pastor Albert at 3 p.m. also on the Chinese Kechara Facebook fan page. And then on Tuesday, there is the Tsem Rinpoche Swift Return Puja. And on Wednesday, there is Pastor Gimli doing the Medicine Buddha Puja live, both on the Kechara Facebook fan page. Also Tuesday, 9:30 p.m. Pastor David and Pastor Niral's Easy Dharma for the New Normal. All right, so thank you guys very much for joining me today. I hope that something in this sharing was useful to you for how to deal with anxiety. I know that I'm going to be putting it into practice myself this week as I feel feelings of anxiety coming up. All right, so thank you guys so much for joining me today. If you have any requests for prayers and offerings to be made, leave me a message in the comments of this live stream and I will get to them as soon as I can and I'll update you. All right. And if you have any special requests for talks or any questions that you want answered, please feel free to ask me. All right. Thank you guys so much for your support and for watching. Please don't forget to do your dedications after this video is over to dedicate any merits that may have been accumulated as a result of you taking the time out this week to listen to this Dharma sharing. All right, I will do my dedications myself after this live stream is ended. Thank you so much for your support, and I'll see you same time, same place next week on the Kechara Facebook fan page with a brand new topic. All right, so thank you guys, and bye.